I am so thrilled that so many of you are here because this is a very, very important topic that we're going to be dealing with this afternoon. The real story, the Holy Qur'an on women, violence, and peace. So I'm very delighted that we have an exceptional program this afternoon with 3 leaders in the Muslim community. If you didn't pick this up outside in the narthex, they are Edina Lekovic, who is sitting here. You have seen Edina on CNN and MSNBC, and I'm always in awe that she keeps her cool against such sometimes unmitigated questions that are asked of her. And she is an ardent spokesperson for the Muslim community. She has a new podcast, Meet the Moment. She is a former consultant of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. She is, I'm proud to say, on the advisory council of the Guibord Center. You can see this, you can read this yourself. And then we have Dr. Laila Al-Marayati, who is a Palestinian-American doctor and Islamic activist and former presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where she served for 2 years after being appointed by President Bill Clinton. In the 1990s, Dr. Al-Marayati served as a member of the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on Religious Freedom Abroad and was a member of the official U.S. delegation to the United Nations 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, alongside former First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton in 1995. And I'm thrilled that we have Dr. Asma Sayeed, who is Associate Professor and the Program Director of Islamic Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her primary research interests include women and gender studies, early and classical Muslim social history, and the intersections of law and social history. She received her PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Wow, I'm breathless with these wonderful, wonderful folks that we have on our panel today. So I thank you for your presence with a full and grateful heart, and let's welcome our presenters. Edina.
Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here and to discuss such an important topic. And quite frankly, I am really surprised that we have a full house, considering the rain and the Saturday afternoon. And so it's really splendid to see your level of interest in this subject. And our plan is to share with you both the foundational understanding of women in Islam within a Quranic worldview, and also delve into the challenges that come up globally around Muslim women and some of these same issues. And so we will each cover a different side of this topic. So now, with a name like Edina Lekovic, you may guess that my family's from Eastern Europe. My family's from the former Yugoslavia. And for me, this is relevant to this topic because while I was born and raised Muslim, and I grew up in San Diego, just a couple of hours south of here, I didn't know many Muslims growing up. And so my foundational understanding of Islam back before the internet came mostly through television screens and film screens, and the occasional visit I would make with my family to the mosque. We were like Christmas and Easter Christians as a family. We did Ramadan, we fasted, but we didn't pray outside of the mosque or work much of faith into our life as a family. And so for me, again, I really hunted for sources to be able to understand this side of myself and my family and my culture because I knew it was a part of my identity I had inherited, and yet I couldn't understand how my family was Muslim because I bought into the stereotypes that I had been exposed to. And this is also the place that I also bought into the stereotypes about Muslim women. For me, growing up, the image I saw of Muslim women through television screens and film screens, no surprise to you, is usually women whose faces were covered, who were not speaking, who did not reflect any kind of feminism that my little girl heart was already captured by. And that only changed for me when I moved here to Los Angeles to go to UCLA, and it was at UCLA that I met Muslim students on campus, and it was in my puzzlement, maybe is the word. I was puzzled why they were practicing a faith that I had no intention of holding on to when I was away from my family, because it was so confusing to me. And that confusion is what sort of led me down a path of curiosity. And so it was in college that I actually read the Qur'an for myself. And that is what I want to share with you, because contrary to the picture that I grew up with, what I found when I actually read the Qur'an for myself was a message of liberation and equity. And that was the reason that I decided, while I was born Muslim, why I decided to stay Muslim or to own my Islam as a college student, and why I continue to remain Muslim today. At its foundation, when we think about the Qur'an's telling, so as Muslims we believe that the Qur'an is the literal word of God to humanity, and that it's a universal message. And we believe that message came through a man named Muhammad, but that message is not from him, that he's just the messenger. And so in the Qur'an, which we believe to be the literal word of God, the story of creation, this is what got me in the first place, is that the story of creation in the Qur'an is one that is rooted in gender neutrality, you might say, where we believe that God says that he created one soul, and from that soul created its mate. And the telling of it is gender neutral. And so too is the rest of the creation story, where Adam and Eve are equally responsible for eating the forbidden fruit, and equally held responsible or sent to earth to live out their lives, and they're equally held responsible for their actions. That foundational story in the Qur'an is what opened the window for me, because I found at the core this place of openness that I hadn't been exposed to. But then as I dug deeper into the Qur'an, I also found that through the Qur'an and the related texts that pre-Islam, that women were treated entirely as property, and that female babies were often buried alive in the desert, right, as a form of infanticide because they were not desirable. But that the Qur'an ended that practice, and also granted women their rights to choose who they wanted to marry, to divorce if necessary, to hold on to their name after they get married, keeping the ties to their own family. Also to earn income as a matter of their own financial security or freedom. So in a traditional Islamic teaching of husband and wife household, the husband is supposed to be the breadwinner. Again, in traditional Islamic teaching, husband is supposed to be the breadwinner, and if the wife chooses to work, and it is her choice, then her income is supposed to be her own, as a matter of, in many ways, financial protection, so that she doesn't stay in a marriage that is unhealthy because of needing to be provided for. And that women also got the right to inheritance and to property ownership and other, foundational rights that we take for granted now, but that were truly revolutionary in that time and place over 15 centuries ago when the Qur'an was first revealed. So it was in this foundation that the Qur'an really provided this foundation for women to be able to be participants within society, not just, plus ones, if you will. And that we also saw in the living embodiment of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on his first wife, Khadija, and who she was as the first person to accept Islam. She was a woman 15 years his senior. She was a businesswoman. She was actually his boss before she proposed to him in marriage. And she continued to do those things over the course of her life. One more note I want to mention, keep an eye on the time, is that Khadija was just one of many women. When we think about like the early embodiments of what the Islamic values placed on women were, she represented that. And so many of these other women who Prophet Muhammad himself, he dedicated at least one day a week to teaching women exclusively in his community, so that he could provide space for them to be open and free with him, and considered them equal members of the community. He was also known to say that the best among you are those who are good to their wives and their children. And he was never known to be a person who even raised his voice towards women, let alone was abusive physically or in any other way towards women or even children. And so as we delve into some of the particulars, even around challenging verses in the Qur'an, how we measure them up against the behavior of Muhammad, who we consider to be this, the sort of best embodiment of the values of Islam and the Qur'an, we are shown, we're shown the best model in this way that is peaceful and accepting and equitable, and looking to create inclusive spaces where women can thrive, not just survive. So this is the foundational teaching that we have towards women and the view of women in Islam. When we look at how that's been carried out over the centuries, there are many different forms it has taken. But I do want to point out that over the centuries, Muslim women have been scholars and heads of state, have been jurists, have been the founders of the first universities in the world, and have been fully participating. Just as at the same time, they are also still suffering from, patriarchy over the centuries that they continue to push back against. So those realities exist at the same time. And I wanted to provide this foundation because as we get into some of the more challenging subjects, we know, as from all texts, that any text can be cherry-picked and utilized for the purpose of the teacher or the person who chooses to interpret it. And so I look forward to the rich discussion that we will have in the conversation after Dr. Laila and Dr. Asma share more about the specifics of the Qur'an.
Thank you. As we say in Islam, assalamu alaikum, peace be unto all of you. I'm very happy to be here as well. I'm going to pick up on the UCLA theme, since it was formative for me as an undergraduate there as well, having grown up at the Islamic Center of Southern California, just a few blocks from here, in an environment where men and women, girls and boys, everybody was treated equally. And it was when I first went to Friday prayer at UCLA, I won't tell you exactly what year that was, but that I was met with a different understanding of what women's participation should be. And I also became aware for the first time of the importance of knowing and understanding the text of the Qur'an, as well as the hadith, which are the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. What's important to understand in terms of the Muslim perspective of these two bodies of work is that Muslims really believe that the Qur'an that we have today in Arabic is the same as what was revealed to Muhammad 1,400 years ago, because of the way it was recorded, written down, and so forth. His sayings didn't go into written form until around 200 years after he died, and there was more risk of having them be somewhat adulterated or fabricated, if you will. And so there are issues related to how we interact with that body of work. And this becomes extremely important when we're talking about the rights of women. And just to pick up on what Edina was saying about some of the foundations of Islam, the way I see it, the foundational principles of Islam that govern all relationships all the time are mercy and justice. God even says in the Qur'an that he willed unto himself the law of mercy, so that if that is what God's criterion is for himself, it's for all of us as well. Anything that violates those principles, then, by definition, cannot be Islamic. No matter what anybody says about it, if it doesn't embody mercy and justice, by definition, it's not Islamic. And that includes any acts of violence and aggression towards others. And even when we talk about acts of self-defense, if we're looking at warfare and a military perspective, on the part of Muslims, it still must be governed by self-restraint. There are many, many rules that govern what kind of action can be taken. When we're looking at the marital relationship in particular, I like to frame it in more positive terms. And the following verse that I'm going to read to you from the Qur'an expresses the features of a healthy marital relationship, sort of the ideal, and I think you can appreciate again the universality of what this says. And among his signs is this, that he created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them, and he has put love and mercy between your hearts. And verily in that are signs for those who reflect. So this is sort of this ideal relationship of tranquility, peacefulness, love and mercy, which will be sustainable for years within a marital relationship. But as we know, in all societies, things don't always work out, and as we wish they would. And Islam, as Edina mentioned, allows for a way out of a dysfunctional, unhappy marriage. through divorce, which is expressed in the Qur'an specifically. And this, if you think about it, in the year 600-something AD, was unprecedented. The rights that women were given, both to choose who they wanted to marry and to be able to end a marriage. So marital discord happens, leading to anger and pain, frustration, and sometimes revenge, sometimes aggression. The sociological background explanation for domestic violence and assault is really beyond the scope of our discussion, but that is sort of the topic of our discussion. But this is a much larger issue that affects people all over the world in every society from every religious, cultural, and ethnic background. And I think it's appropriate to say that Muslims, like everyone else, are subjected to the same triggers and stressors, maladaptive coping mechanisms that impact domestic violence or violence against women across all cultures. In my experience, I'm an obstetrician gynecologist. I work in a community health center in downtown Los Angeles. I've always focused working with people from marginalized communities and women from all socioeconomic backgrounds. It seems that the incidence and prevalence of violence against women is often related to the overall status of women and girls in society in general, as well as general cultural attitudes that tolerate or encourage certain behavior. And we're in the middle of that here with our hashtag #MeToo movement, which seems to be a shocking revelation to people. But those of us in certain professions that have been sort of male-dominated with certain expectations, that kind of sexual harassment, that behavior was the norm throughout all of our training. This is nothing new, this is nothing unique to any group, but it is really quite shameful that we're still dealing with it. The role religion plays insofar as a belief system is, in my opinion, in terms of religious leadership and whether they reinforce attitudes that negatively impact women, and in this case as a result of a patriarchal orientation or interpretation. So this goes back to what does the text say, what does the text mean, and who's interpreting it, and how are they communicating that to others. I do want to talk specifically about a certain form of violence against women, and that's something called female genital mutilation. It's also known as female circumcision, if you will. As an OBGYN, I have done many examinations of women who's been subjected to that practice as part of their asylum proceedings in the United States, and have learned a lot about it. But what happened when I was at that women's conference in Beijing, I was really exposed to this for the first time. And many of us as Muslims ourselves had never heard of it, and yet it was being discussed as a practice that was supported by Islam. And it involves the removal of part or all of the external female genitalia, and it goes across mostly sub-Saharan Africa, and includes people from all religious backgrounds. But there was a perception that this is part of what it means to be Muslim. After doing some research with both Qur'an and Hadith, finding that there really is not a way to support it Islamically, what I found was that there still was sort of this entrenched attitude towards the practice. So when we came back from Beijing, I was on KPFK on the radio talking about some of the issues, and this was an issue that had been discussed in Beijing, and was saying how this is not an Islamic practice and could not be justified Islamically. It's more a cultural, traditional practice. It has to do with the control of women's sexuality. It has a lot to do with other issues about the systems in each place where it's practiced, whether it's Sudan or Somalia. It's much more complex. One of the first people who called into the radio was a man, a Muslim, who said, "The sister doesn't know her own religion." That's how he said it. That was my first exposure to a troll. That's what we call them now. And so he was going to use his religious knowledge to better me on the subject. And this is where the text comes in, which is why we can't just have opinions about it, because the text for us as women on women's rights issues is often used itself as a weapon against us. Fortunately, I had read the text, and I was able to say, well, there is nothing in the Qur'an at all, period. There's no way anybody could argue that. It doesn't come up under any circumstance. And in fact, there are Quranic verses that could say, this is un-Islamic because you're changing God's creation. And then secondly, this notion that women have the right to sexual satisfaction in marriage, if you've removed part of their genitalia and created this condition that makes pleasure impossible, it's un-Islamic. Not only that, there was a hadith saying that the Prophet observed somebody who was doing this because it predated Islam. And he told this woman, don't cut too much. Don't cut what too much? Don't cut where too much? It was very vague. But what's important about this saying is it's considered a weak hadith. It's not one that, and it also is only a solitary. So you can't use it really as evidence to support a practice then that went across centuries and across populations. But if I didn't know that, I wouldn't be able to have the strength to make that argument on the radio, so he's trying to expose me also to all the listeners to be able to say this is why. But what's even more important about this issue, not so much my experience, but the fact that as women in Africa who were Muslim understood that this is not part of their religion, were able to confront religious leaders and say, you have been misleading us all of this time, and we demand that this practice end because it is not based in our faith. And it's that kind of grassroots activism that has enabled them to make a difference. And if you look statistically, you can see there have been declining rates of female circumcision practice throughout Africa. That doesn't mean there aren't those Muslims in some authoritarian areas or in leadership positions that still advocate for it because it's part of their overall emphasis on control of women and their sexuality. But women themselves, based on their own religious literacy, are fighting back so that they can empower themselves to challenge this harmful practice. So that's really just a very short version of a much longer story, but I think it shows how the text can be used negatively. Without it, how we don't have a chance to challenge things, and how women are finding ways through literacy of their own religion to challenge the status quo without having to abandon Islam, which has often been what we've been encouraged to do, is to say, well, just don't be Muslim anymore because it's bad for you and women. But this is not really how we are looking to achieve change. So as women can't always wait for the predominantly male leadership to advocate for them, they advocate for themselves to affect change. And this is a universal concept, a universal practice, right? We couldn't sit around in the medical field and wait around for men to make things better. We are doing it ourselves in academia and what have you, and that's happening for Muslim women everywhere. And this, I think, is something that is ongoing. The challenges are great, but it is a movement that is real. So, thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. It really is wonderful to see so many of you here, a packed house, as it were. I want to start with thanks to Reverend Dr. Guibord for inviting me here. It really is, as I said, wonderful to see so much interest amongst the broader public in these topics, and it's wonderful also to share a forum with Edina and Laila on these issues. So I'm going to speak for, I hope, the right amount of time. And I've set my timer so I don't run over because professors notoriously run over. And I apologize in advance if some of what I'm saying is a bit more specialized. I'm happy to answer questions and discuss later. I want to start by saying that, I find the title of the panel very interesting. I mean, it very specifically and directly addresses the issue of Qur'an and violence against women. And I have to say that, I teach a class on the Qur'an, I teach on Muslim women at UCLA, and one of the first things that I say is, I'm assuming that, my audience at UCLA are here, that you're here to understand about Muslim women. Something about Muslim women, something about their realities. And this seems very counterintuitive, but I would say that the starting point for understanding about Muslim women and their realities cannot be the Qur'an, actually. It has to be contextual. You have to think about the historical context, the political context, the socioeconomic context, and by socioeconomic I include a woman's class standing. Is she rich, middle class? Is she poor? What's her educational background? So we would never sort of try to understand Christian women by looking at verses in their contemporary realities by looking at verses in the Bible. We wouldn't try to understand Jewish women today by looking at the Torah and the Talmud, right? So in the same way, I think that it's helpful to look at the Qur'an, but you have to understand that the Qur'an is always mediated by individuals, and it's mediated by communities. And so that is, for me, always the first starting point for talking about the Qur'an and women. So, I mean, rather than starting from, sort of Qur'an and violence against women, I think it's good to step back then and say, what does the Qur'an have to say about woman and gender, which gender is actually a very modern notion across the world. But if we want to talk about the Qur'an and woman and gender, it's important to look at all the verses and not, again, to cherry pick and just talk about, what are the challenging, problematic, difficult verses. So when we look at the verses collectively, there are a number of observations, very general observations that we can make. The first is that the Qur'an actually has very, very little to say about women specifically, okay? I mean, there really are just a handful of verses that talk about women or women's issues or what we can say is sort of a gender-related issue. And this is in spite of the fact that there is a chapter, an entire chapter called Woman. And this is very misleading. The ways in which chapters are entitled in the Qur'an often doesn't actually bear a correlation to what the chapter is actually about. So the chapter on woman is about all sorts of things, and there are only a handful of verses that actually relate to women. So when you collect all the verses, and I say just a handful having to do with women and gender, there are two types. One is what we might call historical, right? And this is verses dealing with women in human history. And here we can talk about Eve. We can debate whether she's actually a historical character or not, but let's just say that she was. The wife of Noah, the wife of Pharaoh, during the time of Moses, the Queen of Sheba, the wives of the prophet, and of course Mary. That pretty much is a list of every woman who's very specifically referred to in the Qur'an as a historical character. Now, what's interesting about the Qur'an's mention of these women is that the Qur'an really is not concerned with them as women per se. It's concerned with them as human beings and the ways in which these human beings, they happen to be a woman, provide us with sort of moral lessons, let's say. So Mary is an exemplar. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is an exemplar for a woman, a human being who sacrifices a tremendous amount in the way of God, a woman who is open to divine inspiration, who receives a divine message. Similarly, the wives of the prophet are just hailed as humble, obedient humans, right? I mean, they happen to be women. So what's interesting is that, again, the Quranic mention of these women is very, very bare bones, just human exemplars. So let's take Eve as an example. The Quran really doesn't even name Eve, I don't think, as far as I can remember. And Edina referred to this. The story of Adam and Eve in the Quran and their fall from what we might call divine grace is presented as one in which they have shared responsibility, shared moral responsibility, and shared culpability. However, and this is where it gets tricky, if you look at exegesis, that is interpretation of the Quran, you see that Eve ends up bearing the greatest blame. Okay, she is the one who she is the one who is basically responsible for the fall from divine grace. And there's been a lot of scholarship, academic studies of this in the past decade or so. And what's very interesting is that, as some of you may know, Islam developed in what we call the late antique period, 7th century, 8th century. There was tremendous interaction between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. There was a lot of dialogue. Muslims looked to Christians and Jews and their scholars to understand how to interpret the Quran. And they actually borrowed a tremendous amount from rabbis and priests in Quranic interpretation. That's made its way into the legacy that we have, the corpus of interpretation that we have. So much of what we know as Muslims about Adam and Eve is actually taken from biblical, Judaic, and Christian traditions. And so there's some very interesting scholarship done on this topic about the interreligious exchanges that happen to shape Muslim views of women. The second category is what we might call prescriptive, right? So this consists of verses on things like inheritance, marital discord, socioeconomic hierarchy, testimony, modest dress. And again, because the purpose of this is to also just understand some of the, what we might call challenging or problematic verses having to do with women, I'm going to focus on those for the rest of my time. There are, I would say, 3 categories that prompt particular concern when it comes to the Qur'an on women. One is women's testimony, another is inheritance, and the third is, I just will call it domestic discord, and we'll get into the specifics of that hopefully later. But when it comes to testimony and inheritance, the Qur'an sort of mandates, for example, with testimony that it's 2 women equals 1 man, right? So the testimony of 2 women. This is in verse 2, 282. This is chapter 2, verse 282. That essentially the testimony of a woman is worth half of that of a man. And similarly, with shares of inheritance, women are not accorded the same shares as male heirs. And these are very technical matters that I don't want to get into in much detail here. But I would say that, if I were to sort of list problematic verses, right? It's verse 4, chapter 4, verse 34, relating to marital discord, that probably leads to the greatest number of problems and questions as concerns the Qur'an and women. I want to preface, discussion of verse 434 by saying that each one of these verses is subject to interpretation. And very broadly speaking, right, in the first 2 topics, inheritance and testimony, there are very few Muslims who actually interpret this literally, right? And what many Muslims do is they say they were intended for contexts where patriarchy was very strong, where men were the primary caretakers and the primary earners for a household. And many Muslims themselves are advocating for interpretations that account for a dual career household, where women are sometimes the sole earner. So with respect to 434, which I think quite unfortunately has been now called the beating verse, Muslims also advocate a variety of approaches. And I'm going to just read the verse to you, and in 2 instances I will just substitute the Arabic word for the English translation, because I think the Arabic word has given rise to a variety of interpretations. So verse 434, it says, "Men are in charge of women by right of what God has given one over the other, and what they spend for their maintenance, for taking care of them from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in their husband's absence what God would have them guard," as being modest essentially. "But those from whom you fear," and the Arabic word here is nushuz, so that's been translated in a variety of ways: arrogance, disobedience, etc. First advise them if they persist in this nushuz, right? Forsake them in bed, and finally daraba. And daraba, typically the Arabic word daraba is translated as hit, strike. But if they obey you once more, they're obedient, then don't seek a way against them. Indeed, God is ever exalted and grand. So, you can, of course, understand how in the contemporary period, in the modern period, when any sort of physical reprimand or even a verbal reprimand is sometimes problematic, this verse has given rise to a number of debates and discussions. So I'm just going to make a few generalized comments about the interpretive tradition. We can take up discussion on it later. The first is that no Muslim scholar, and really, across history, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about patriarchal systems, 10 centuries ago or whatever, but no Muslim scholar with any degree of authority has ever understood this verse as a divine sanction for wife abuse. Okay, that's just not how anyone with any authority has ever interpreted it. And this is not to say that there aren't, stupid, abusive Muslim men out there who say, oh, that's what I think this verse means. Here I'm talking about an authoritative framework. So no Muslim scholar says that this condones abuse, domestic abuse. And the second point is, I think for me as a historian, a very interesting one. There's a consensus amongst scholars, again, that the Prophet Muhammad's words and actions are the most important framework for interpreting this verse. And Muhammad was never known for engaging in any kind of physical reprimand of any wife, of any of his wives. He had several wives, or any of the women of his household. And there's an interesting background story to the revelation of this verse. According to one of the most widely accepted accounts, Muhammad was arbitrating a dispute between a husband and a wife. And the wife came and complained to him that my husband slapped me. And the Prophet was about to say, well, you should retaliate, basically maybe perhaps slap him back. But just as he was advising this, so goes the account, he received this particular verse. And his response, I think, is worthy of tremendous it gives you pause. What he said was, we wished something and God wished something else. Well, God wishes his best, right? And at that point, sort of the commandment for retaliation or recommendation for retaliation was revoked. But the fact that Muhammad himself spoke these incredible words, essentially of what we would describe as a conscientious pause when reflecting on this verse, is deeply embedded in the interpretive tradition. So whether you go to 8th century Arabia, or you go to the 21st century in England or Germany or the United States, every scholar has taken this particular conscientious pause into account. And again, like I said, no one has said that this verse endorses beating of wives. And when scholars have, and this is primarily in the pre-modern period, have said that it does mean some kind of physical reprimand, what they say is, okay, it means with what was the equivalent of a toothbrush, right? And a tap, not a beating in particular. And we have to understand all of these within pre-modern contexts where gender hierarchy was very much a part of the sociocultural systems. So just in conclusion, it's, again, I think very interesting as a historical phenomenon to remember that the task of interpreting the Qur'an fell largely to male scholars for most of Islamic history. It is very rare to find any interpretation by a woman. And here I mean a published interpretation. Women were probably interpreting the Qur'an in informal contexts, but they didn't necessarily write them down and publish them. And a very exciting, more modern development, I would say, primarily 20th century, is that women are becoming more and more engaged in exegesis, interpretation as scholars of the Qur'an, and attempting to reinterpret verses in light of what they see to be a message of gender equity that's enshrined in the Qur'an. And so somebody like Amina Wadud, who is an African-American scholar, she's an academic actually, is doing some of this interpretive work and trying to bring her understanding as a woman, as a scholar of Islam, to the table to see how that might impact a broader interpretation of the Qur'an. And there are three important issues that I think are worth keeping in mind when we think about the interpretive tradition, interpretations of the Qur'an. And I would summarize them as this: authenticity, authority, and reasonableness, right? So if an interpretation seems authentic to a broad and deep-seated Muslim scholarly tradition stretching back centuries, it's far more likely to be accepted amongst Muslims. And that's really key here, right? How are Muslims receiving what people say about the Qur'an? I mean, as Laila said, some people say, well, Islam's not good for you, women, just abandon it, right? But I mean, so Muslim women who are invested in their religion aren't going to be receptive to that kind of a message, right? So authority and authenticity are really important. So authority here is whoever's doing the interpreting has to be known as a scholar who's grounded in the tradition. So one of the problems that some women, especially in the West, have who don't know Arabic is that they don't know Arabic. So they're reading the Qur'an through English translations and attempting sort of reformist actions and measures, but people will say, well, do you know Arabic? Have you read the classical tradition? If they don't, then their authority is a little bit diminished. And lastly is reasonableness, right? I mean, is the interpretation that you're putting forth a reasonable one? And here, I mean, just to round up with, getting back to this word daraba, which, in broadly speaking, in Arabic, the most frequently known translation of that is something having to do with physical reprimand. And so those who translate that word in ways that might sort of draw on a lesser known meaning, like to walk away is also a meaning of daraba, right? Just don't gain as much traction because that translation, unfortunately, or I don't know, how to characterize this, is not seen as a reasonable translation. Muslims would much rather go with the reasonable translation of an Arabic word, even if it doesn't necessarily jive with, sort of whatever contemporary movements might be occurring, and say, okay, well, this is what the Quran says. Let's be honest to what the Quran says, but let's understand it in a broader context, right? Let's see what the Prophet did with it. The Prophet didn't hit any woman, so it means that, we're not supposed to hit. But were they going to start taking daraba and say, well, it means just walk away? Probably not. But I don't know. I mean, Muslim communities have gone in very, very interesting ways with respect to interpretation, so I think that is an open question. So thank you all for your attention. I went over time. Sorry.
I think you had talked for us to have a discussion amongst ourselves. I was just going to make a comment about that verse too in my own experience. So as I was saying, like Edina, I was raised, my father's Palestinian, mother's American. We were Muslim light. Islam was sort of part of just being raised in an Arab household. Weren't really taught the religion. When I was around 15, starting in Ramadan, I started to read the Quran in English because that's what I knew. And all of it spoke to me in the gender-neutral way, and this is a book for all humanity. And then I would get to these verses and not know what to do with them, so I stopped thinking about them. I said, I'm not going to dismiss an entire religion based on these verses that perhaps I don't quite understand. And it took me some time to finally go back to them when I was much older. And one thing that I came to understand was that, and this is also reading different hadith traditions and learning more about the historical context, where it was a physically violent society. You'll read a story, for example, of one of the companions. Someone came to him and told him something, and he was so furious he grabbed the man by his beard and hit him and threw him. Or they beat the slave because she said X, Y, or Z, and you're like, oh, they sort of hit people a lot. And if we think about, I'm old enough to know what it was like to grow up being spanked as a child. God bless my parents, but they were doing, that was normal. And so if you think about it, I looked at this whole issue of a timeout, because most people who engage in violence in the household are not taking time and being thoughtful about, well, first I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to hit you, right? And so it's an act of aggression, out of anger, it's impulsive. And this was a way, just like other things that came up in Islam, like they didn't prohibit alcohol immediately. It said don't go to prayer drunk, before it eventually came to be. So that's how I processed it in my own mind, to be able to say this, by the time you get to that point, the likelihood of wanting to physically strike somebody is much, much smaller because the anger, the frustration has dissipated. On the other hand, I never, ever could understand what the word misused meant, and maybe you can enlighten us on what it means to be nashes, because that's still used even in Islamic courts, in terms of divorce proceedings and what the rights of the wife are if she is in that state, which if you could help us understand.
I mean, I can't really. And one of the main reasons for that is that and this goes to the question of authority, I am not a Muslim jurist, although I do have my PhD in Islamic studies. Islamic law and interpretation are highly specialized disciplines. But what I can say broadly speaking is I think that in English, the word recalcitrance, right, captures some of that, but then unfortunately, the specific ways in which that word recalcitrance is understood is left up to the discretion of a judge or a jurist, and that's where the problem is, right? That judges and jurists, all of them, or husbands, embedded in their particular time of place, recalcitrance unfortunately can sometimes mean she looked at me the wrong way, or she walked out when I told her not to. So I think that is a problem of interpretation, essentially.
Before I go to you, Edina, I do want to just bring on this issue, make a plug for a movie documentary called The Judge.
Yes.
And it is about the first Muslim woman who is a judge in an Islamic court in Palestine. And this issue it's a fascinating film to watch, just how she asserted herself to be able to achieve this position through her knowledge, authority, education, and study, the challenges she faced, but also dealing with these issues of advocating not only for herself, but for women who come before the court. And this issue, it doesn't go into great detail about that in particular, but it does come up. But I would really encourage you to see this film if you have the opportunity. It's in sort of limited release right now, but that's something to think about.
So I also, in listening to you both speak, something that came up for me was how many times we face text, right, that comes with context, and we're not raised with that context. And when I was first, a decade and a half ago, asked to give talks about women in Islam, it was a very textual talk. It was, here's where the rights were guaranteed by Islam, because the faith itself had all the magic. It was liberatory. All the principles were there. But to hold that separately from how it was practiced over 15 centuries plus, right, is all the different societies and the different interpretations. And I realize now as an adult how much of my growing up with Islam was through the lens of culture, and how the way that I'm able to do the compartmentalization now as an adult is through the lens of culture. Because when I think about things like stoning or honor killings or female genital mutilation, or there's a long list of them that are all punitive. Almost all of them are cultural. Like something like stoning doesn't come from the Qur'an. Acid attacks or honor killings, none of these come from the Qur'an. They're pre-Islamic practices that somehow Islam was unable to eradicate, by trying to apply this set of principles on top of a society, and we're left continuing to fight back against culture and preserve the faith. And what I do think is important for people to note is that it's not just Western Muslim women that are fighting for Muslim women's rights. Like people, we have this sort of let's go save them attitude sometimes. But if you even Google Islam and women, as I did this week, because I always like to do this ahead of talks, I assume people are going to go home and do that. Part of what you'll see in the news link is stories about Muslim women who are coming to the defense of other Muslim women. So like women in Kenya who are supporting Muslim women who are being held liable for adultery in cases that are not as, not that black and white, or women campaigning against acid killings like in Pakistan and in India, acid attacks, or any of these other things, that there are Muslim women who are fighting for women's rights, reclaiming the Qur'an, not discarding the Qur'an. And that's often a piece of the story that I think gets pushed to the side. The other piece that I want to highlight, and I'm curious about how you both think about this too, is how often hijab, or the headscarf, whatever form it takes, is politicized and weaponized. And the Qur'an Women in Violence puts the issue in the Qur'an on some level. But when I think about the Qur'an Women in Violence, I think about how how often Muslim women in hijab have been targeted in our country because of other people's interpretation of the relationship between that piece of fabric and their holy text. And how, we're coming up on Ramadan. Last Ramadan, there was the case of Nabra, this young African-American or African immigrant teenager who was wearing hijab, who was brutally killed in the middle of the night during Ramadan. There was a Somali American woman in a hijab who was brutally attacked on the street in Ohio. There was the African American Muslim teenager in Portland on the metro train who was the white men who jumped in to protect them. A couple of them ended up being killed. But these ways that Muslim women have been targeted with violence in particular ways too, that also is a result of the stereotype. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like a no-win situation, I guess, is the words that come to mind, but how complex these things can be.
Well, as you're saying that, we are very fortunate to be living in the United States. We tell our children, you're not victims. To be a victim is to be, on a refugee on a raft in the Mediterranean, watching your child die because they can't swim. That's not who we are. But these things are very real. And on the one hand, as women, we're talking about experiences, having these conversations, being attacked, being threatened by our co-religionists because we're challenging the status quo and being told you can't say this about Islam. But on the other hand, especially for the women who appear more Muslim than some of us do, are then the targets for people who have other attitudes about Islam as being a threat to the general population. So it is kind of a no-win situation. And even some scholars have said, out of concerns for safety, for women who feel it's a religious obligation to cover their hair, you can cover in a way or not cover to preserve your safety. This is this notion of necessity. So even, for example, as a physician, if you're not supposed to see the opposite sex without any clothes on. Well, if your only doctor is of the opposite sex, this is what happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban first came. Women were not allowed to see male doctors. Imagine if you have a heart condition and the only cardiologist is a man, too bad. So this notion, and they didn't understand even themselves this notion of darura or necessity, so that in order to preserve life, which is a goal of the laws of Islam, that you will have to make exceptions sometimes to these rules. But Muslims, by and large, try to not really talk too much about that. It isn't always the best option for people, but then we're left kind of in this position of defending ourselves, trying to be empowered, and then being perceived as a threat to either our own other Muslims or to the rest of society. And when most Muslim women, pretty much all Muslim women, really just want to live their lives like everybody else.
I don't think I have anything.
So let's give them a round of applause. I mean, this has really been terrific. Thank you so very, very much. We want to open it now to Q&A.
I read in the newspaper last year, excuse me, that there was a Muslim female physician doing genital surgeries, like the one you have been discussing, in the United States, in a clinic. And she went in front of the court, and her defense was that she was only practicing her religion. And here we're talking about a physician, a highly educated, very sophisticated person because of all the education she has. So what has been the response from the Muslim community in the United States? Because when this physician was caught, it was not the first time. She had been for several years having families bring girls to her from different states in the United States. Thank you.
The community reaction to that piece of news, people were in shock and horror. I mean, it was somehow a well-kept secret, but I guess an open secret to a certain degree, because certainly this woman had people who were involved in this practice, and she admitted that she was engaging in that practice too. But the same questions that you have are ones that I have, and that I know so many other Muslims have, is how this woman could, especially could be in this position to do this. I don't have any good answers for you in that regard. But for what it's worth, the good news is it's a tiny problem, and it was rooted out, and that's what we need more of. And there are, luckily, obviously I think in many of our communities, taboo is the main thing that we're fighting against, so that there can be more open conversations about these things. And there are more organizations now that are doing proactive work around sexual education and around reproductive health, so that women and girls have the ability to talk about these issues themselves. And there are, as part of the Me Too movement too, there are more women who have been subjected to female genital mutilation who are coming forward and telling their stories, and in order to sort of to be disruptors in the process. I don't know if you want to talk about this as a physician.
Yeah. First of all, I would say that the acts of one physician, the fact that she's using religion to justify it, is just an example of what I was talking about. What does she know about the religion? And she, just looking at it right now, is a member of a minority sect in India. So it's a really different community than the ones I was talking about that are exposed to the most severe forms of genital mutilation, where they remove the labia, the clitoris, and all of that in parts of Africa. It's the same problem, though, using religion to justify it. I will say that in Islam, circumcision of boys is considered mandatory as a part of Abrahamic tradition. And so there's the perception among some Muslims that, well, if circumcision is good for boys, then some form of circumcision, which could be less or more than what people might think, and I won't get into technicalities about the female anatomy, might be appropriate as well. And that tends to be where some people go. And they're saying, well, if we only remove a small piece, and we do it under a local anesthesia, and the child doesn't suffer, then it's not any different from male circumcision. And this is a form of sort of apology, if you will, for a practice that really cannot be universalized for Islam. They can't make the same claim about it as male circumcision. So she will justify it however she's doing it. I do not know exactly what she did, but it is, and the law that makes it illegal doesn't tell you from like a clinical medical perspective what exactly has to take place for it to qualify as female circumcision. The World Health Organization has categorized type 1 through 4, and there are certain features you look for to be able to tell what kind, and obviously the more advanced, the worse it is in terms of consequences for women. But any form of female cutting is considered to be illegal in the United States. At the same time, I listen to advertisements in the news about vaginal rejuvenation for women who want to have plastic surgery to recreate a certain reality in that part of their body. And it's always sort of an interesting flip to me that somehow there's still this obsession with women's bodies in that way, that somehow we have to always be improving upon them, either taking things away or adding things, because we just can't be satisfied with what they are. But this is an example of a person who is doing something that she believes to be correct. People will use religion to justify abuse. They'll use it all the time, but she's also in the minority, as you mentioned, and the community rightly rejects this kind of practice.
Yeah, I think that, part of the issue here is that the ways in which these incidents are portrayed in the media. So, I found it interesting that you talked about her being a physician and an educated woman, right? And so, the media themselves don't take the trouble to distinguish between somebody who has an MD and somebody who actually knows about Islam as a religious tradition. And so when they present it as an educated Muslim, you think, okay, they know about the religion. And then you think, oh, they must know that whether this exists in the religion. Actually, she clearly doesn't. She clearly doesn't root her practice in any kind of what we call scriptural sanction or anything like that. And what's interesting to me is that, she's clearly just a woman out to make money. That's what it is. She was making money off a practice that was lucrative and that was, sort of under the cover. And that's just the bottom line. It's coincidental that she was Muslim and using them. There's so many people like this across all religious traditions. And one thing I will say with going back to the issue of authority and understanding, what I've noticed is how many sort of talking heads there are in the media who have nothing more than really an incidental knowledge of Islam, who are willing to get up and talk about it and not contextualize that they don't know. But there are, many people who have a far deeper knowledge who are just not willing to sort of, for whatever reason, go out and represent the religion. So there is this problem of who's doing the representing in the public sphere that I think is giving rise to misperceptions.
So I have a little bit of confusion. I'm hoping you can just speak to this. This idea that you can't cherry pick, and you really have to look at the Qur'an as a whole. Taking that to heart, it seems to me there's also a lot of what you're saying is also about looking at context and acknowledging that the Qur'an came about in a time that reflects the patriarchy of that time. And so in that way, looking at the Qur'an as a historical document. But then you started out by saying that the Qur'an is believed to be the literal truth of God by Muslims. And so I guess I'm just wondering, do you consider the Qur'an a literal document or a historical document? And if it's a literal document, how then do you deal with the fact that it's a inherently patriarchal document? I mean, it has a chapter called Women. It has these verses about women. I appreciate that there's gender equity and gender neutrality, but there is also obviously a patriarchal voice. So.
Yeah, it's great that you bring this up because I as it happens, I am teaching a class called The Qur'an at UCLA, and one of my starting points there is just this very paradoxical idea enshrined in all scriptures across world religions. And what I mean by that is that every scripture presents itself as a universal, timeless text. It is, whether you're talking about the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Vedas, whatever it is, they are meant for all people and all times in every geographic region, right? But at the same time, they were clearly, whether you want to say revealed, recited, written in a particular space and time. And they reflect that space and time. And that's where the task of interpretation is so important and critical, because that's where it takes scholars in any religious tradition. Here, let's talk about Muslim scholars, to understand what is meant to be historically particular and what is meant to be timeless. So, yes, absolutely. So that's a great example. And I'll tie it back to what Edina was saying about Muslim women advocating for their own rights. So there, you have a Quranic verse that says, I think it puts it in a particular socioeconomic context of women not going out as much, but I don't remember the exact. For the testimony.
The testimony is when you write a contract, you have to have a witness to the contract. And so you bring a witness, and it says if you can't find a suitable male witness, bring two women so the one can remind the other. Right. And that's how it's put. But it's really very technical language about the importance of witnesses for contracts. And some people, the point is not so much about the witnesses as it is about the importance of honoring contracts in a way that wasn't before. It just couldn't be sort of a wink and a nod, if you will. So the fact that women were brought into the whole process in the first place is really quite remarkable. But then it's sort of undermined by the fact that it takes two. But it was still shouldn't be forgotten. Again, just the overall picture isn't really, this verse wasn't about women. It was about contracts and witnesses and the importance of them participating in that transaction.
I guess I'm just trying to get that if it's a literal truth, then in a way it doesn't matter that historically at the time it was rather remarkable. Today, are women in Islamic law required to bring two women for every one man? And then how?
Yeah, and so again, this is where the act of interpretation is very, very important, or the enterprise of interpretation is very important. So in many countries where Islamic law is implemented, there are judges who will continue to say, okay, two women one man for a variety of contexts, right? Whether that's, a contract or whether that's a criminal investigation, et cetera. But then there are others who say, right, other interpreters and jurists who say, no, that was for a time and place in which women weren't out and about as much, and so they didn't know sort of the economic realities of their time, or et cetera. And then, so then one woman could help the other in terms of knowledge, et cetera. So there is, again, an interpretive spectrum. But for the most part, and here, is where it gets tricky, the places where you have Islamic law practiced are generally patriarchal, more traditionally oriented societies. So you'll see government sanction for this 2 women, 1 man thing, but there are interpretations. So in Morocco, there's a real push towards reform by men and women of interpretation of such verses.
I also want to raise that Sharia looks and sounds different in every country in which it's practiced. Yeah. And in some Muslim majority countries, Sharia varies by region. So Sharia is what we commonly understand in America as Islamic law, as if there's like a book in which like the 10 Commandments that you would find. But Sharia is 15 plus centuries of human interpretation of the Qur'an, which we believe to be the literal word of God, plus the Sunnah, which is the example or embodiment by Muhammad, the stories that we have, and all the human interpretation of that. So it's full of all kinds of internal contradictions. So there is no one-size-fits-all Sharia. In fact, there is a choose-your-own-adventure Sharia that is taking place in most places around the country. And if you even look on, I think I was just looking quickly, but I think it's on, I first discovered this on Wikipedia, actually, where they had I think it was under Sharia law or something, that they had a map of the different forms of Sharia that were practiced in different parts of the Muslim majority countries. And so there's a lot here. And the other piece about this universal versus, fixed versus flexible piece is technically, if we want to get literal, slavery is acknowledged and regulated in the Qur'an. There is no Muslim majority country in the world today where slavery is practiced or sanctioned. True? Fact check me. And so there has been somehow this ability to eradicate one type of practice that has become antiquated. Unfortunately, we've seen ISIS, which is, I will save my profanity for outside of church, but which has gone into, speaking of cherry pick, take the worst, most misogynistic, dehumanizing cherry picking that they can do and turn women into sexual slaves, turn human life into, dispendable, call other Muslims infidels and make their blood, cheap. I mean, just a total disregard for life. So we see both of these realities are true, right? Like that's the state of religion in the world today. And it may also be the reason I think that so many of our young people are running the other direction. The category of unaffiliated, or the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are the most rapidly accelerating group of any religious affiliation. And I think that these are some of the complexities that, are sort of washing people away in the process. And that's why we have to be able to deal with them head on. And this is imagine having these conversations with teenagers. How often do you as Christians talk to your teenagers about the violent verses in the Bible? How often are you forced to? How often are your teenagers forced to answer questions about the violent verses in the Bible to their friends at school? This is the reality that Muslim teenagers and Muslim youth are facing. So it's some of them choose to claim Muslim pride and wear, girls wearing scarves as an expression of their faith, as a measure of pride, not of religiosity. So, and we assign meaning on it that they're not assigning themselves. So it's just very complex. People are complicated.
I think that's the point I would like to make as well. It's not an either-or question. Is it a historical document or a literal document? The answer is yes. Mm-hmm. There's been centuries of thought to these things. People take it very seriously, and it doesn't mean that all of a sudden women are excluded now from the courts. There's also a huge body of work looking at the role of, say, that this isn't actually a requirement in a criminal case that you have to have 2 female witnesses, because there were stories of the Prophet where women came and gave testimony and it was accepted. Not only was she female, but she was a slave, to then exonerate somebody who was accused of a crime. So it's complex, and I think sometimes we try to oversimplify things related to Islam and Muslims when really there's a lot more to it. But it's really, these are things that are taken very seriously and that people are challenging. And you have scholarship, you have jurists, you have somebody like Asma Qureshi, who's at the University of Wisconsin, who had an interpretation of certain rules related to punishment for women who are being accused of fornication when they accused a man of raping them and he denied the claim. Then she was confessing for a sex crime and was put in jail. So she was able to look at the laws surrounding this from the Islamic perspective to enable the Islamic courts, whether we agree with them or not, whether they should be there or not, to be able to say, you're looking at this as the wrong kind of crime, and rape should be actually viewed as something akin to highway robbery, for example, and the proceedings that govern that, and that you don't have to have a confession from the criminal in order for it to be prosecuted as a crime. But she gave them the tools to be able to use that, then they translated it into Urdu and were able to implement it in the court. So these are people who have a very serious interest in looking at really difficult subjects and trying to bring the level of society up to those values that I talked about at the beginning, which are of justice and mercy, and look at the spirit of the law as much as the letter of the law. And Muslims have gotten stuck in the letter of the law. Oh, it's always got to be 2 women and 1 man, and forget the spirit, the context, the realities. And this border between what's related to the context historically, what is universal for all time, we're constantly grappling with that. But what we're trying to say, I think, as Muslim women is that in spite of that, there's still so much about what it means to be Muslim that we're continuing to express ourselves as Muslim women and to be faithful in our own religion.
By the way, I've been doing research on women's issues for 20 years now. And this is one of the best panels I've seen. I'll tell you why.
Yes.
I'll tell you why. The reason is that you brought 3 women interpreting Qur'an for men or others, rest of the world. What you're doing is taking the Qur'an, assimilating it the way it's supposed to be, and then interpreting it from the lens of women, right? This doesn't happen often. The scholars write books and give lectures, but internalize the concept and what does it mean to me in a larger context is the biggest strength. Now, let me extend that a little bit more because we, professor, always like to lecture, as you said. But I think the point I'm making is that it is also very unfair to expect any one scripture, not just Quran, any scripture, accountable for violence, right? And I think to say that Quran causes violence or Bible causes violence is a very narrow way of looking at these things. I'm a social scientist. I come from empirical data. I tell most of you, if you are interested in violence and women, the United Nations has a website called UN Women. They produce data. And I combine the countries. You'll be surprised. 4 or 5 countries that rank highest in the world in terms of human quality of life, they come from Scandinavian countries. Norway, Denmark. That part is not surprising. What is surprising that those countries do not have any less violence against women. Now, a country like Denmark, that is ranks number 1 in human quality of life, why would the 55% of the Danish women have a lifetime prevalence of sexual violence? So the point I'm making is that cause of violence is much more complex than trying to pin on one document, one religion.
Well, while you're finding the next person, I want to push a book that's written by a woman named Dr. Asma Barlis, and it's called Believing Women in Islam, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Qur'an. This was one of the first books that I read that gave me the language to be able, that confirmed what I sort of already was feeling. It's called Believing Women in Islam, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Qur'an, and it's by a Muslim woman, academic and scholar, who again, like it's like Amina Wadud, reclaiming the text. And I think that there's a parallel to be made of, we think about conservative voices in almost any faith, they tend to be literalists, and more progressive voices tend to be more spirit of the law folks. Yeah. And the same is true within the sort of Islamic spectrum of ideologies out there, is the more conservative, the more literal, the interpretation. And that, I think that's part of a universal truth that's available to us here.
Thank you for your comment.
Given the importance of interpretation, what do you think is the most effective way to put women in a position where their interpretation has the same validity and effectiveness as men's?
It's an excellent question, because I think that given our particular, speaking of context, given our particular context, what we want to see in majority Muslim communities is a scenario in which women are stepping forward, offering their interpretations, and those interpretations are being accepted and promoted and enshrined in law, etc. But again, after looking at these issues now for quite some time, I realized that really the more effective way to go about this business of reinterpreting texts for a particular place and time is true grassroots reform that engages both men and women. So there are very few platforms that I can think of when we think about sort of hot issues as far as Muslim communities are concerned, where only men or only women have put forth a reformist stance that has gained traction. And, looking at, I keep bringing up Morocco because I'm doing field work there, and it's just a really fascinating sort of melting pot of North African and European, Arab, African cultures. But the legal reform there, which addresses issues of inheritance and women's status, really has been promoted by both men and women. And that's the reform that has been the most effective, I would say. And there are plenty of, let's not forget that there are plenty of men out there who are advocating for what we consider to be universal rights, including women's rights. And I think that's what works the best, actually.
Quickly, there's a great American project related to this point around like turning men into our allies rather than looking at them as adversaries. It's called The Side Entrance, and it was started by a woman in Chicago named Hind Mekki, and it's just a photo, it's a website, it was started as like a Tumblr, a photo website that just showed women's entrances to mosques and women's prayer spaces with just captions of where, when, and that kind of thing. And it allowed men to see what women's prayer spaces looked like. And with the assumption that if you could just see what sometimes these rooms are much smaller or inadequate or sort of like converted other spaces, and that project has been able to open up conversations nationally within our communities, and in some cases internationally, just around women's prayer spaces where it's been adopted as campaigns. So just holding up a mirror, sometimes, and enlisting men, as you said, as allies in this process, and realizing like, no, they, many of them want to help this cause. How do we do it together?
I also think that's the spirit of when the Qur'an says that believers, men and women, are protectors one of another. And it's this notion of synergy, working together, not just in relationships, but as believers, as a community, we all together enjoin the doing of what is right and forbid the doing of what is wrong. And similarly, when it comes to domestic violence awareness and talking about the interpretations and being able to say this is not Islamic, you have a number of imams giving the Friday sermons talking about this issue, whereas before you could have a talk and have a panel and they would say this is a women's issue and women only would attend. So it is a partnership, but I think more and more female scholars than we've had ever before who can cross the bridge between being knowledgeable in American or Western academia as well as with the Islamic texts, with the Arabic. Because without that, they don't have credibility. As smart and as capable as they are, that's just how that world works. But I've always struggled as an activist with like wanting all that interesting conversation going up in academia to trickle down. We're like, you know, bring it to the people, bring it to the mosques, let the individuals know. Sometimes we're better about having these conversations with non-Muslims than Muslims themselves. So we do have a lot of work to do there, and part of it has to do with connecting what is that really rich discussion and change going on up at that higher level to the community. It's a lot harder because it is a question of who has access. The internet initially was a space where we could find women's voices, where you could be heard without being physically threatened. I remember giving a talk and having somebody almost throw a chair at me. Well, now you could go on the internet and they could figuratively do it and you didn't have to worry. But we've seen how the internet over those 20 years or so has totally morphed now, so it becomes a space of bullying in and of itself. But at the same time, these kinds of discussions have a place and are not silenced, because women's voices were silenced for a long time. So that space still gives us that opportunity so that you can find these things, you can look them up, you can read them, you can buy the books, you can amplify the message, you can share it. And that is an opportunity women have never had, which may be why we don't know about those women scholars from centuries ago who surely existed.
Yeah. May I just add one other thing? Is this on? Yeah. So I think that it's also important to remember that just because it's a woman promoting a particular interpretation, that doesn't mean that that interpretation is not also going to uphold what we call patriarchy. I'm very wary of these labels, but you know, there was a very interesting study recently done of a female Ayatollah. I mean, she wasn't an Ayatollah officially, like of the Iranian clergy, but a very, very educated Iranian Shi'i woman, and she's written an interpretation of the entire Qur'an from beginning to end. Very, very educated, but when you actually look at what she says about the verses on women, it essentially reproduces what we call patriarchal interpretations. So it's, you know, and again, we see this across cultures that, you know, women many times favor patriarchal models. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that we should sort of shy away from that. We should engage it. What are they seeing in that is bringing some sort of comfort to them at some level or the other? And we shouldn't sort of kind of label it as them being regressive or not enlightened or whatever. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Yep.
Hi. I was listening to what you were saying about bringing some of that knowledge from academia down into the mosques. Do you believe that Islam is suffering from a problem with class more than it is with gender? Because you're talking about the people being very educated and sophisticated, and that's great, but there's a real divide between the educated individual and the common individual. And if you don't have the connection between the two, or if there is a perceived looking down upon for the lower group of people, for the uneducated group of people, then even if you got the information, that group wouldn't receive the information because of a perceived slight.
That's a very good comment. I think it's almost more on the level of sort of the sociology even than anything else. And it's interesting depending on where we're talking about the Muslims. By and large, Muslims in the United States are among the most highly educated Muslims in the world. The socioeconomic status compared to Muslims elsewhere is better. But that being said, there are divisions among certain groups, among certain communities. And I think maybe what I'm talking about is that sense of sort of elitism. That's not so much socioeconomic, but it is sort of, and no offense, but that academic snobbery, like you know, and they use words like hermeneutics and things that I still don't know what that means, and just stop saying it because it's not helpful. But it's that kind of divide that I think is really important, and it is this inability to sort of understand that the non-specialist, the non-scholar, still has the legitimate right to have the conversation and to ask the questions and to come up with different ideas that maybe nobody else ever thought of before. We're not creating new laws, we're not creating fatwas, for God's sake, but we're trying to have an exchange. But it is that sort of perception, regardless, I've felt it even regardless of the socioeconomic difference or even educated, because most people are, have a high school degree, a high school diploma, and probably some level of college education. So you're talking generally about highly educated people who could handle that conversation, but we're not PhDs and we're not in academia. And sometimes that's where I see the gap.
Can I messy that a little bit? I'm going to muddy it a little bit in the sense that we now know from data that of the 3.5 million American Muslims, we have an almost equal percentage in the most highly educated and the highest income bracket as we do in the lowest income and lowest education levels. And so while there's been a lot of emphasis in our community about the upper end, right, that we're like the second most educated faith group or all of these superlatives, we have an equal number at the other end of the spectrum. And I want to make the connection that there's also a connection here around religious literacy. The people who are academically literate and at the highest levels are not necessarily, don't carry religious literacy. They may not have been raised knowing all of these, all of the nuance, but because they have a higher level of academic success, there is an assumption that they somehow raise up their Islamic knowledge as if or their religious literacy more than they actually have. And so things are really muddy because a lot of imams too haven't been trained in how to translate this stuff to the lay person and be able to talk about, some of the stuff here in the weeds in a way that's understandable. So the average person just takes the conclusion that they were raised with, right, is this is okay and this isn't okay because that's the way it was always done in their family. And they universalize that to that's what Islam is. Because religious literacy is, I think, one of our hardest questions today.
I have a more speculative question. The Quran was revealed in a patriarchal society in the mid-600s in Middle East area. Supposedly it's a patriarchal society at the time. So my what-if question is that if more female actually interprets the Quran, would the Quran actually espouse a matriarchal society, or it would actually sort of emphasize an equality between both genders?
Not necessarily, and I think this goes back to, you mean over time, right? This goes back to the point that I made earlier, that just because you see that a woman is doing the interpretation, you assume that the interpretation is somehow going to reflect what we call gender egalitarianism or promotion of women's rights, et cetera, and that's not how it plays out historically. They're actually, from the pre-modern period as well, there are female scholars who were very, very active. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, there are many women activists, but many of them also upheld patriarchy. So I think that, often we project from our times onto all sorts of other times and places and think that, our values would, if people could just understand, they would sort of replicate our values. And I don't think that is necessarily true.
I was just going to say, too, one way how this plays out on the issue of female circumcision is that the people who engage in this practice, who perform it in these African countries, are women, often midwives or other local practitioners. The mothers of the daughters are the ones that take them to have it done. When these women have challenged it, saying, I'm not going to do it, and then it threatens their social status, sometimes it's been their fathers who have really advocated for them and protected them from backlash. So because of whatever reason, maybe it's economic for the women who gets paid to do the practice, or for the mother to say, nobody's going to want to marry my daughter because she doesn't have this procedure done to her, whatever. Even when you have education and when you have all of that, some of these cultural beliefs that are embedded and go back generations are very hard to undo. And as much as we would like to say, oh, just being female means you're going to have a better interpretation, doesn't always translate that way. And that is why we're looking to those partners who have the courage to say something and be different for whatever reason, in whatever circumstances, because once they take that step, they become a leader, and then people who maybe in their hearts have always felt this wasn't right then can follow, whether it's a man or a woman. But the idea of it being in partnership, I think, is kind of what we're wishing for.
And I'm going to be snide for a second, if you'll allow me, and also point out, like, women work against their interest all the time. I was just saying under my breath, think about 53% of white women who voted for Donald Trump. This is not something that, you know, that's peculiar to Muslim women sort of buying into their own oppression, if you will, right? Like there are certainly much bigger systems at play. So I would like to believe that if I had access to more Muslim women scholars over the centuries, that I would have a deeper and richer understanding of that process, that evolution. I'm really excited now to have Muslim women scholars to turn to. That book I mentioned to you was like a turning point for me. I knew what I read in the Quran, like I talked to you about in the beginning, spoke to me, and I saw the equity there, but I needed the backup, right, to be able to have the language and the arguments to be able to engage my fellow Muslims in that stuff, and that was part of the process. So having female scholars to rely on meant all the difference. To one more text, there's a new study Qur'an out in the last couple of years that was translated by a team of 5 American Muslim scholars. That team included a woman, and I want to promote the fact that she doesn't wear hijab too. Like when women in hijab get so like normalized as talking about authority and credibility and truth and all of that, right? If you don't wear a hijab, where's your authority? I get that enough wearing my hybrid hijab that I know how much it gets used as a weapon against so many others. So we now have more and more texts to be able to utilize, and that's a huge windfall for young women who are Muslim and feminist and can be able to use that language more freely with together.
I actually just wanted to make a quick comment about the question about academics and others, sort of what you call the lay public. I think one of the real challenges, and again, this is across religious traditions, is that for academics, sort of understanding the complexities of things and the layers and presenting ideas and historical movements in their complexity, that's their bread and butter. And then when you, for me, for example, a constant challenge is, I wrote a 250-page book on women and the transmission of religious knowledge across Islamic history. If I'm asked to show up in a mosque and give a talk on that and a few sound bites in 10 minutes, I just can't. I'm like, oh, you want me to take my life's work and just reduce it to that? It's not gonna, I don't think I used hermeneutics today, but I always, did I?
No, you didn't.
Okay, but I always try to simplify, but I feel that it comes at the cost of a tremendous amount of complexity, and I can't do the soundbite thing. So I think that is, again, a problem across religious traditions, and not particular to Muslims, Christians, Jews, that people work in their niches, and making bridges is always a challenge, building those bridges.
Thank you. A couple of us at work, I'm a teacher, we've talked about how many religions flourish because of how they liberate women of that time. When, case in point, the Bible's talking about no divorce, it was like because men were just kicking women to the curb, because I want a new one. And that granted stability and financial security and things like that, not to mention other things. Do you find that, and it's not even, but as time goes on, whether we're talking religion or not, things get corrupted and used for the benefit of a few. Have you grappled with that, or have you embraced that, or have you seen that in your religious studies period, whether we're talking Islam or just a faith practice in general?
I think that's what we're talking about when women look back at the origins of Islam, and you see women who were part of the community, women who participated on the battlefield, they owned their own businesses, they were active, they were and it is through the lens of how we want to see it, because of how we, that ideal, but the text is really pretty consistent. And then you realize over time, you're like, wait, what happened to all of that? And that is what a lot of these scholars or women's organizations that are saying, we want to go back to that. The marital contract, that is to protect me, and how did that turn into something that it's not? And so we got this intervening 1400 years, and that's, I think, what's different now is that depending on where people were from, if you took religious authority, you didn't see yourself as the owner of the text, as somebody who could read it. The concept of religious literacy, I think, is kind of a new one, isn't it? I mean, even in general. Because we always had priests and imams and all those people doing all that and telling us what we were supposed to believe, and that our faith, how strong our faith was how much we followed them. And Muslims are stuck there still right now. But you're seeing all of this movement for women to say, well, when you go back to the original text, and when you see what the Qur'an is saying, when you take away all of this other junk, it's pretty good as far as liberating, which could explain why we're up here as active, involved, liberated American women. People are like, how could you be Muslim? And you're like, you have no idea, just read the text. So I think that's pretty much defines where we're at as women, as Muslim women in a lot of ways, and what this whole struggle is about, to say that what we believe is what our religion said originally has somehow got forgotten because of the layers of society and culture and domination, what have you, and we want to bring it back. And also, not to mention, just in a general political sense, that if you could silence one half of your population as an authoritarian ruler, you're already, ahead. Then you just got the rest to work with. And that subjugating women, not just in the domestic sphere, but politically, was always going to make sense in that sort. So we're fighting back now, and that's for some women too.
Yeah, it is. I just think about the difference between my mom's relationship to Islam versus my relationship to Islam. My mom relied on the village imam to tell her, just bringing to life what Laila said, relied on the village imam. That was the word of God, right? If he says this is okay, then we're doing it. If he says it's not okay, then we're not doing it. There was not a direct relationship with the text in any way. It was always mediated by somebody else. Whereas my relationship with the text was direct ownership in college. And the minute that I learned the verse that says there is no compulsion in matters of faith, I didn't need anybody to tell me what that said, what that meant. So if I saw Saudi Arabia or Iran forcing women to cover their hair, well, that violates directly the text I can see before my eyes. Having those conversations with my mom, we are still talking across the decades when it comes to our relationship to Islam and our sense of ownership and our own sense of authority. I don't need anybody to tell me I have an authority. I'm reading those words like God revealed them to me. And then I compare that to my 3-year-old daughter. God knows what her relationship to Islam is going to be like, and the choices that she will make and the ways that she will interrogate the text. I think that it's an extraordinary marker of where the times that we're living in.
Okay, I know that there are other questions, and the hour is upon us. I want to thank the three of you from the bottom of my heart for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you.